Have you ever felt invisible? Have you ever sacrificed everything, only to return home and realize the world has moved on without you? This is the story of Sarah Carter, a war veteran who risked her life for her country only to face an even greater battle when she came home. For thousands of veterans like Sarah, the war doesn't end on the battlefield. It follows them home, into job interviews where employers see them as too rigid for corporate culture, into government offices where their claims for benefits sit untouched for years, into a society that celebrates their service but turns its back when they need help. Rejected, forgotten, lost. But Sarah was different. She refused to be ignored. She refused to accept defeat. And when she reached her breaking point, she made a decision that would change everything. What happens when a woman with nothing left to lose stands up to the most powerful man in America? When she confronts President Donald Trump in front of live cameras and demands what every veteran deserves. The entire nation held its breath as history unfolded before their eyes. It was an icy winter morning in Washington, D.C. The White House press room buzzed with reporters, cameras flashing, keyboards clattering. As the president prepared to address the nation, no one expected the press conference to take an unexpected turn. But in the back of the crowded room, one woman stood up, her voice, steady yet filled with years of struggle, cut through the noise. "Mr. President, I need a job." What happened next shocked the world. Stay with us because this is a story you won't forget. Sarah Carter had spent 10 years in the U.S. Marine Corps. She wasn't just another soldier, she was a leader, overseeing logistics in high-stakes combat zones, ensuring her team had everything they needed to survive. Under gunfire, in the harshest conditions, she made split-second decisions that saved lives. But when she returned home, the battlefield she faced was entirely different. There were no bullets, no explosions, only silence. The uniform that once earned her respect now felt like a burden. She believed her service would open doors, that she had built skills that any employer would value. She was wrong. With no corporate experience, she found herself drowning in rejection letters. The skills that once defined her discipline, leadership, resilience were now seen as obstacles. Her identity as a veteran, once a badge of honor, had become an invisible barrier between her and a new life. The rejection emails all looked the same. "We appreciate your service, but, unfortunately, we've decided to move forward with another candidate." Over and over. One interview stood out. She sat across from a hiring manager, her resume in his hands. He skimmed it, then sighed. "Impressive military record," he said, tapping the paper, "but we're looking for someone with real-world experience." Real-world experience? As if leading soldiers under fire, managing life or death situations, and navigating high-pressure logistics wasn't real enough. Another employer hesitated. "We worry about military culture. The transition can be difficult, and some veterans struggle to adapt to a corporate environment." Sarah felt the sting. They didn't see a capable, determined woman. They saw a problem, someone damaged, someone they didn't want to take a chance on. With every rejection, the weight on her shoulders grew heavier. And soon, the frustration turned into something else: anger. One evening, Sarah sat on a worn-out park bench across from the White House, the cold biting through her thin jacket. She had spent the last of her savings. Her rent was overdue. The government she had fought for, the country she had bled for, had turned its back on her. Tears burned in her eyes, but she refused to cry. She clenched her fists, breathing in the freezing air. If no one was going to listen to her, she would make them listen. Then, a thought struck her, a crazy, impossible thought. She would go straight to the President of the United States. No more emails, no more rejection letters, no more waiting for an opportunity that would never come. She would stand up in front of the entire nation and demand what every veteran deserved: a chance. That night, she made her decision. Tomorrow, she would walk into the White House press conference. Sitting on that frozen bench across from the White House, Sarah Carter's frustration boiled over into determination. She had sent out dozens of applications. Ignored, rejected, forgotten. No one wanted to give a veteran a chance. But what if she didn't wait for permission? What if she went straight to the top? A live presidential press conference was scheduled for the next morning. It would be televised nationwide, with reporters from every major news outlet. If she could just get inside, if she could speak directly to President Trump, she could make America listen. It was insane, risky, possibly illegal. But it was her only chance. Sarah didn't have an invitation, no press credentials, no official access, but she had one thing: strategy. Arriving outside the White House early, she watched as journalists entered in groups. They wore press badges, carried cameras, and clutched notepads. That's when an idea struck her. Approaching a group of reporters, she straightened her posture, adjusted her jacket, and acted as if she belonged. "Excuse me, are you with the Washington Post?" she asked casually. "No, the Baltimore Sun," one man replied, caught off guard. She nodded professionally, pretending to check an imaginary list. Then, she fell into step beside them, walking toward the entrance as if she were part of the press corps. And just like that, she was in. Sarah had barely taken a breath inside the press room when a deep voice stopped her cold. "Where's your press pass?" She turned to see a Secret Service officer. His sharp eyes locked onto her. For a moment, her heart pounded. If she hesitated even for a second, she would be thrown out. Game over. But she didn't flinch. She met his gaze, calm but firm. "I don't have one." A beat of silence. The officer's eyes narrowed. Then she added, "But I served 8 years in the Marine Corps. I'm here because I need to speak to the president, and I'm not leaving until I do." Something in her voice must have struck a nerve. The officer hesitated, then gave a slow nod. She was in. The White House press briefing room buzzed with energy. Journalists filled every seat, their fingers poised over keyboards, cameras clicking as they adjusted their angles. The air was thick with anticipation. Another day, another presidential address. The room stilled as Donald Trump walked onto the stage, dressed in a dark suit and red tie. He moved with his signature confidence, nodding slightly as he stepped up to the podium. Flashbulbs flickered, reporters murmured, preparing to question him on the economy, foreign policy, and national security. But they had no idea that today, one woman was about to change everything. For several minutes, Trump spoke about job growth and the economy. But Sarah wasn't listening, her hands clenched into fists, her heart pounding. Then she stood up. "Mr. President, I need a job." The room froze, heads snapped in her direction. Reporters turned, eyes wide, camera lenses swung toward her, capturing the unplanned moment. Trump paused, mid-sentence. He blinked, his mouth slightly open. No one ever interrupted a presidential press conference like this. Sarah's voice was clear, unwavering. "I served this country for 10 years. I led soldiers. I made life or death decisions. But when I came home, no one wanted me. I've been rejected by every company I applied to. No one wants to hire a veteran. Tell me, Mr. President, how do I survive?" A heavy silence filled the room. No one moved, no one breathed. The world was watching. At first, Trump's expression was unreadable. His arms folded across his chest. His sharp eyes locked onto Sarah. But as she spoke, something shifted. His gaze softened, just slightly. He leaned forward, his curiosity now mixed with something else: respect. "What did you just say?" His voice was low, commanding. Sarah didn't hesitate. "I need a job, not a handout, not charity, a chance." Reporters exchanged glances, their fingers racing across keyboards. Secret Service shifted in place, ready to remove her. Trump raised a hand. "Hold it." The agents froze. His eyes narrowed. "You're telling me you served in the military, but now you can't find work?" Sarah nodded. "Sir, employers don't want veterans. They think we're broken. They think we don't fit." Trump exhaled, shaking his head. "That's ridiculous." He turned to his advisors, some of whom looked visibly uncomfortable. "Is this true? Is this really happening?" No one had a prepared answer. Trump's gaze flicked back to Sarah. "You come up here." The room erupted into hushed murmurs. Sarah's pulse pounded as she stepped forward. She could feel the weight of 1,000 eyes. The camera is zooming in. Secret Service moved instantly, stepping toward her, blocking her path. "That's close enough," one agent warned. She stopped. She could see the uncertainty in their faces. Was she a security risk? A protester? A threat? Trump raised a hand again. "Let her through." The agents hesitated. Then, with reluctant nods, they stepped aside. Sarah took a breath. This was it, her moment. She walked up to the podium, standing face to face with the President of the United States. Trump studied her for a long moment. Then, he smirked. "You want a job?" he asked. Sarah nodded. "Yes, sir." Trump turned to his advisors. "Does the Department of Veterans Affairs need people?" A hesitant pause. Then, one of them muttered, "Always." Trump looked back at Sarah. Then it settled. "Monday morning, you report to the VA. You want to fix the system? Let's see what you can do." The room exploded. Breaking news headlines flashed across screens within minutes. Sarah had come for a chance and in front of the world. She had just made history. Sarah stepped into the Department of Veterans Affairs headquarters in Washington, D.C., feeling a strange mix of determination and unease. The office was massive rows of cubicles stretched endlessly, phones ringing non-stop, stacks of paperwork piled high on desks. She had expected efficiency, urgency. Instead, she saw sluggish movements, exhausted employees, and a sense of indifference hanging in the air. She passed a waiting area filled with veterans, some in wheelchairs, some elderly, some young but already worn down by life. They sat silent, defeated, their eyes scanning the room with an all-too-familiar look, hopelessness. A woman at the front desk shuffled through folders so thick they looked ancient. Sarah caught a glimpse of one file, a benefits claim from 2014. Still, under review. Her stomach tightened. This wasn't inefficiency. This was a crisis. She had come here to fight for change. But standing in this place, she realized the battle would be bigger than she ever imagined. Sarah was assigned to the claims department, where veterans' disability and pension requests were processed. Her job? Review pending cases. She sat at her desk and pulled the first file from the towering stack in front of her. It belonged to Hank Lawson, a Vietnam veteran. His claim had been sitting in limbo for over 15 years. His record showed severe PTSD, chronic pain, and a disability rating that should have qualified him for benefits years ago. She grabbed another file. 8 years pending. Another. 9 years. Her jaw clenched. How many veterans had been left to suffer because of endless bureaucracy? She turned to the employee next to her, a tired-looking man in his 60s. "Why are these taking so long?" He sighed. "Too many cases, not enough staff, and too much red tape." He shrugged. "Most veterans just give up." Sarah felt her blood boil. Veterans weren't giving up, they were being ignored. And if this was how things worked, then she had no intention of following the rules. Sarah stormed into the office of Richard Coleman, the VA's HR director, slamming a file onto his desk. "Tell me why this veteran has been waiting 15 years for his claim to be processed." Coleman, a gray-haired bureaucrat with a polished suit and cold expression, barely looked up. "Ms. Walker, you're new here. There's a system in place." Sarah leaned forward. "A system that's failing. You're burying veterans under paperwork while they're out there losing their homes, their families, their lives." Coleman sighed, rubbing his temples. "We process thousands of claims a year. Change doesn't happen overnight." Sarah's fists clenched. "Then we start today." Coleman smirked. "You think because the president put you here, you can fix everything? You'll learn soon enough this place doesn't change." Sarah met his gaze, fire in her eyes. "We'll see about that." She grabbed the stack of pending files and walked out. If no one else was willing to fight, she would. Determined to expose the failures within the VA, Sarah spent weeks digging through mountains of paperwork, searching for patterns. The more she looked, the worse it got. She found files that had been untouched for years. Veterans who had died before their claims were ever processed. and applications rejected for minor clerical errors that could have been fixed in minutes but instead left veterans without support. One night, sitting in her office long after everyone else had gone home, she came across a hidden backlog of over 200,000 unprocessed claims. Some dated back over 2 decades. Veterans had been calling, emailing, pleading, but no one ever responded. She documented everything. If the government wouldn't fix this, she would force them to. But she couldn't do it alone. She needed allies and she knew exactly where to find them. Sarah reached out to veteran advocacy groups, people who had spent years fighting for reform. Only to be ignored. She met with homeless veterans, wounded warriors, and families who had lost loved ones waiting for benefits that never came. Then she took a bigger step, the media. She called every journalist she could find, leaving voicemails, sending emails, knocking on newsroom doors. Most ignored her. They had heard stories like this before. Nothing ever changed. But one journalist, Rachel Miller from the Washington Post, agreed to meet. Rachel sat across from her in a coffee shop, arms crossed, skeptical. "What do you want from me?" Sarah slid a thick folder across the table. "Proof." Rachel flipped through the pages, photos of unprocessed claims, documents showing deliberate delays, emails where VA executives laughed about waiting out veterans until they gave up. Rachel's face hardened. "This is a scandal." Sarah nodded. "I need the world to see it." The moment Sarah's investigation gained traction, the bureaucracy fought back. Richard Coleman, the VA's HR director, called her into his office. His usual smugness was gone. "You're making a lot of enemies, Walker." His voice was low, controlled. "You need to stop." Sarah leaned forward. "Stop? Veterans are dying waiting for help." Coleman's expression darkened. "This isn't about helping veterans. It's about politics. The system isn't perfect, but it's what we have. You're stepping on the wrong toes." Later that day, she found her email access revoked. Then, her office was reassigned to a remote corner of the building. Files she had been working on suddenly went missing. But Sarah wasn't backing down. If the VA wanted to play dirty, she would turn up the heat. The fight wasn't just about veterans anymore. It was about exposing corruption at the highest levels. The next morning, headlines exploded across the country. Revolving light breaking news. VA bureaucracy left thousands of veterans without benefits for years. Revolving light. Revolving light government cover-up? Whistleblower reveals shocking neglect at Veterans Affairs. Revolving light. Rachel Miller's article detailed everything Sarah had uncovered: the unprocessed claims, the deliberate delays, the corruption. Within hours, news stations picked up the story. Veterans flooded social media, sharing their own horror stories. Sarah watched as Washington scrambled to respond. Senators demanded investigations. The White House issued a statement of concern. Even President Trump, who had hired her just weeks ago, was forced to address the crisis. Within days, the pressure on the government was overwhelming. With veterans protesting nationwide, the White House had no choice but to respond. A press conference was called. Sarah stood in the crowd as reporters hammered government officials with questions. And then, as cameras rolled, Trump pointed to her. "Ms. Walker, step forward." This wasn't just her fight anymore. This was a war, and she was winning. Within 24 hours, Sarah Carter's name was everywhere. Her story dominated headlines, trended on social media, and sparked nationwide outrage. News networks ran special segments, showing interviews with veterans who had been waiting years for their benefits. Twitter exploded with the hashtag #JusticeForVets, as thousands of veterans and their families shared their own horror stories. Sarah was invited onto news programs, from CNN to Fox News, where she exposed the deep-rooted failures of the VA. Politicians, once silent, rushed to respond, scrambling to show support for veterans before the public turned against them. Late-night talk show hosts praised her courage, while government officials scrambled for damage control. But the real pressure came when Congress announced a formal investigation into the VA's failures. Sarah wasn't just another frustrated veteran anymore. She had become the face of a movement and the government had no choice but to listen. Days after the scandal erupted, Sarah was called back to the White House for a private meeting with President Trump. She stepped into the Oval Office, where Trump sat with top officials from the Department of Veterans Affairs. He wasted no time. "You made a lot of noise, Walker." His tone was sharp, but there was something else: respect. Sarah stood tall. "I didn't do this for attention. I did it because veterans are suffering. And now the world knows it." Trump nodded, then turned to his staff. "What do we need to fix this mess?" The VA secretary stammered, listing bureaucratic excuses: funding delays, outdated policies, lack of personnel. Sarah cut in, "No more excuses. We need real change: faster claims processing, direct employment programs for veterans, and full transparency." Trump smirked. "You think you can do better?" Sarah didn't hesitate. "Yes." Trump turned to his team. "Then give her the damn authority to do it." Within weeks, the first reforms were set in motion. Fast-track benefits processing: cases older than 5 years were prioritized and reviewed immediately. New veteran employment program: businesses were offered tax incentives to hire veterans. Whistleblower protections: VA employees were encouraged to report corruption without fear of retaliation. VA Accountability Board: Sarah Carter was placed in charge of an independent team that audited and restructured failing offices. Sarah personally oversaw the clearing of tens of thousands of backlogged cases, ensuring that veterans finally received the support they had earned. For the first time in years, hope was returning to America's veterans. And it all started with one woman who refused to be ignored. 1 year after Sarah Carter stood up in a crowded press room and challenged the president. She stood there again, but this time, she wasn't an outsider. She was the change. The White House briefing room was packed with reporters, officials, and veterans. Flashes from cameras flickered, capturing this historic moment. President Trump stepped up to the podium. The room fell silent. A year ago, Sarah Carter stood in this very room and called out a broken system. She didn't just talk, she took action. And today, I am proud to announce that Sarah Carter will officially take on the role of Secretary of Veterans Affairs for the United States. The room erupted. Journalists scrambled to take notes, some clapping in admiration, others stunned by the unprecedented appointment. Sarah took a deep breath as Trump gestured for her to step forward. This was her moment. Trump turned to Sarah, a rare look of genuine respect in his eyes. "You fought for your country on the battlefield. Then, you fought for your fellow veterans in the halls of Washington. And I trust your judgment more than I trust half the bureaucrats running this town." A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd, but the weight of his words was clear. "We made promises to our veterans. And for too long, those promises have been broken. But under Sarah's leadership, that ends today." His tone hardened as he addressed his staff. "She has my full support. And if anyone in the government wants to slow her down, they can pack their bags." Turning back to Sarah, he extended his hand. "Now go do what you do best: fix the damn system." Sarah shook his hand, but the real words everyone was waiting for were hers. Sarah stepped up to the podium, looking directly into the cameras as if speaking to every veteran across the country. "I know what it feels like to be forgotten." Her voice was strong but raw with emotion. "To every veteran watching, this is your victory. You are not invisible. You are not a burden. And you will never be ignored again." She paused, scanning the room, knowing her words were reaching millions. "Change doesn't come easy. We have a long way to go. But I promise you this. I will fight for you the way we fought for this country. Because we deserve better." The room erupted in thunderous applause. That night, headlines across the country blared. "Revolving light: Sarah Carter, once rejected, now leads the VA. A new era for veterans begins." Revolving light. Sarah Carter didn't just find a job, she changed a system that had failed veterans for decades. And because of her, thousands of veterans finally got the justice they deserved. Sarah Carter's journey proves one thing: Change doesn't happen by waiting, it happens by standing up and demanding it. She refused to be silent, refused to accept defeat, and in doing so, she changed the lives of thousands of veterans. One voice, when fearless enough, can ignite a revolution. There are millions of veterans out there, still struggling, still waiting for their voices to be heard. You can make a difference. Support veteran organizations, advocate for reform, and most importantly, listen to their stories. Because no one who fought for this country should have to fight just to survive. As Sarah once said, veterans don't need handouts. We need opportunities. We need respect. And most of all, we need a country that stands by us the way we stood by it. If you believe in this fight, share this story. Speak up, because together, we can make sure no veteran is ever forgotten again.